Hello, I'm Kate Fitzgerald from the Learning Hack team, welcoming you to a new episode of Great Minds on Learning. In this highly acclaimed series, Professor Donald Clark, internationally famous author, blogger and entrepreneur, joins John Helmer to explore 2,500 years of thought and theorising about learning from the Greeks to the geeks. In this episode, we delve into the transformative ideas of three influential late 20th century educational theorists. Each began with a flourishing career in teaching, but ultimately left the classroom behind, driven by a growing disenchantment with the educational system. Their collective experiences culminated in an incisive critique of conventional schooling, sparking calls in some quarters for comprehensive educational reform. But compelling as their arguments were, did they achieve any enduring impact on the landscape of education?
All schools make some sort of show at teaching the pupils things, and a headmaster pin up a huge timetable of lessons, etc., which make the heart sink when you look at it. I mean, do the great British nation understand that thousands of its young pupils are looking at Latin, before their breakfast have even settled? I mean to say, how would they like seeing Minora, Minoraris, Minorature, etc. at that hour, eh? Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Great Minds on Learning on Critics of Schools. I'm here with my co-host Donald Clark, as usual, and that was, of course, a quote from The Curse of St. Custard's Nigel Molesworth, a fictional character created by British children's author Geoffrey Willans in the 1950s, who didn't very much like schools. Donald will be introducing us this time to an excellent group of theorists who looked at this subject not so much from the learner's point of view as Molesworth does, but certainly from a more academically respectable one. And it follows on this episode in a way from our last one, where we looked at educational theorists and practitioners in the first half of the 20th century who offered alternatives to mainstream schooling, Steiner and the like. This time we focus on three thinkers in the latter half of that century who, taken together, make a more frontal assault on mainstream education. It's not experiments and alternatives we need, they told the world, so much as a wholesale reform of the education system. And maybe that isn't even enough. Maybe we just need to tear the whole thing down. Donald, is that a fair summary of this group, would you say? Can you enlarge on that description, please? And also tell us what is significant about the time in which they emerged?
Yeah. I'll just throw in there, I like your literary. I love that impression, by the way, John. That was impressive.
Thanks very much.
It's the first ever full-on impression in the podcast. And it reminded me of another figure, and I'm sure you could do him very, very well indeed, and that's Thomas Grind from Hard Times and Dickens. Because he actually said, that, in fact, Grind was the very opposite. Of course, he was promoting the idea that you should have this industrial revolution type factory view of schooling, very fact-orientated. I'm sure you could do an impression of him as well, no doubt.
We'll work it in later in the series, perhaps.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but in terms like Grinding, he came to regret the fact that he had these views because it started to affect his own family. There's a really brilliant bit in Hard Times that I always liked, which is there's a girl, and it's like it right at the beginning of the book, called something Sally Jupe or something. She comes in and she's a circus performer, so she knows horses and she does the ride back of the horses, and then she gets really poor marks on the horse bit of her essay because she wasn't factual enough about horses, even though she knew them, could ride them and so on. And he's quite clever, Dickens, and uncovering these things through characterization. It's like that's his big skill, really, isn't it? Anyway, back to what we were talking about there. I think what's interesting about this group, John, is we have schools and schooling. And then there are a number of things that come around on the back of that, which is a critique of it, because we gave a critique of that, and everybody's got a bit of a critique of schooling because we all went there and we think we could do it better, but it's actually quite hard for teachers and the politicians to reform anything. But there have been this group, this quite special group, who focused on words like deschooling or unschooling and homeschooling. And that's what we're focusing on today, those three words in a sense. You have people like Ken Robinson and Hirsch and another podcast we'll be doing, no doubt. These are the people who critique skill and think it could be bettered or improved. But this group are actually much more critical than that and think it should be, in a sense, dismantled, hence deschooling, unschooling, homeschooling. In other words, these are not like the other past podcasts we did on Montessori, for example, or Steiner, or people who wanted to just radically change a school and flip it around. These people actually want to, in a sense, they're against schooling as we know it. And the three people are indicative. There are many, many people in this field, and we could have picked a lot. But I think the big, on deschooling, if we take that one first of all, the idea that, institutionalized learning isn't as necessary as people think, and then we can sort of unravel it. The big figure in that area is, of course, Ivan Illich, who sounds Russian, but Illich. And then, but there are others like Paul Goodman carried on with that sort of stuff. He was an American writer, poet, sociologist type guy. He carried on in that tradition. So we must remember there are many more than just the people we pick up on here. But there are also, if we then go on into the unschooling movement, which is a slightly different thing, that's much more about child-centered view of education. We're going to be tackling John Holt there, who's the big figure in this area, the big beast, as it were. And John Holt, his legacy was kept going in a very famous newsletter and books by Pat Ferenga. So all these people, the stuff is carried on, as it were, going on from this. And then we have homeschooling, of course, with John Holt. And then another really interesting figure, and that's John Taylor Gatto, who taught in Harlem in New York when it was a rough and tough old place, and won, best teacher in the US type award, plaudits galore, and then just gave it up one day. And what was interesting was his reasons for him giving it up and his recommendations about what we should do other than the schooling he had taught in and experienced. So deschooling, unschooling, homeschooling, these are the things we'll be tackling today.
And how about the time when they come about? Because there's sort of from the late 50s through the 60s to 70s and 80s. And of course, that kind of coincides with the alternative culture, the counterculture, those sort of cultural and actual sort of revolutions all over Europe, like, the Paris 68 and so on. It's a time when the counterculture was born, so to speak. Does it have anything to do with that? I mean, they're not really figures from the left, are they really? They're more on the...
Not really, yeah, that's a good question. Illich was a priest, for example, but I think you're right, because the timing, I've got my copy, my well-thumbed copy. It's actually, when you get a book with all your things falling apart, and it's a good book. And I can't remember when it was published, but I think it was the 70s. But I shall tell you right now, 1970, 71. So that's interesting. That's right after the 68 world, the revolution, as it were. And I think you're right. On the back of that big movement came this group of people. In fact, they're roughly around the same time, really, as they grew and started publishing. And there was also, I remember then, a more sort of hippie vibe around homeschooling. Yeah. Some of the US was religious, that sort of thing. I think that's what's changed and what we'll discuss today, because maybe we'll round that up towards the end, but we're going through a period now post-COVID where this is a real alive and kicking issue, because many kids have not gone back to school and many parents have decided not to send them back to school. And suddenly we find we're in a world where actually it's quite possible to homeschool your kids, even though you don't know any maths or science. So we can leave that to the end, I suppose. But it's a good point about it. It had its time, really, unlike Montessori and so on, and Steiner, who were much earlier, come out in the 19th century tradition. These people are, very much second half of the 20th century. Ivan Illich, 1926 to 2002. The Reverend Monsignor Ivan Dominic Illich, to give him his proper title, was an Austrian Roman Catholic priest, theologian, philosopher, and social critic. Born in Vienna, his father a civil engineer and a diplomat from a landed Catholic family with kind of Croatian, what is now Croatia, origins. His mother came from a Jewish family that had converted to Christianity. Nevertheless, she had to move to Florence to escape persecution by the Nazis in 1942. I found that a bit odd. I mean, I'm going on the Wikipedia description here. It mentions something about the father, whether he went with them.
Florence obviously was in Italy, which was under a fascist dictatorship as well. But perhaps she felt safer there as a Jewish person than she did in Austria after the Anschluss. I'm really not quite sure. Anyway, Ivan studied in Florence and Rome before being ordained as a Catholic priest in Rome in 1951. His first parish was in one of New York's poorest neighborhoods, Washington Heights, on the northern tip of Manhattan, at that time a barrio of newly arrived Puerto Rican immigrants. People who've seen West Side Story will kind of associate with that vibe. In 1956, at the age of 30, he was appointed vice rector of the Catholic University of Puerto Rico. So moving from Vienna to New York to Puerto Rico, which is sort of part of the US, not quite sure on the exact status there. But he was later thrown out of that because of his criticism of the Vatican's position on birth control and the nuclear bomb. And he continued to quarrel with the church and eventually resigned as a priest. And I kind of know something about the background of this as a cradle Catholic. We had this very, slightly liberal Pope, John the 23rd, I think, during the 60s. And the church seemed to be moving in a more kind of liberal direction. And then all that got closed down with Paul, who came after, and the rather authoritarian nature of the church prior to John got kind of reasserted. Anyway, Illich continued to quarrel with the church, and he did resign as a priest, but it seems that he practiced. He gave masses and communion and stuff like that afterwards. So there was some sort of thought that they were going to set up an alternative version of the Catholic Church, but that came to nothing. His seminal 1971 book, Deschooling Society, criticizes modern society's institutional approach to education, an approach that constrains learning to narrow situations in a fairly short period of the human lifespan. Donald, what was his criticism of the education system? To me, those criticisms seem a bit entangled with his disenchantment with the Catholic Church. So can you disentangle that for us, please?
Yeah, that's right. It's interesting. The religious angle, which you focused on there, is a really strong strain in the book, Deschooling Society, which is a brilliant book. Even if you disagree with every last word in this book, it's short, it's intense, and it's absolutely brilliant. It's a must-read if you work in our field, I think. But I think the religious thing, funnily enough, wasn't necessarily the Catholic Church. It's often thought that he wanted to just get rid of schools full stop, which was not the case. That's not actually what he argues for in the book. The main argument in the book is the separation of state from the church, the separation of school from the state, I should say, but also from that sort of religious impression. And it wasn't so much the Catholic Church, he mentions that, but it's actually Calvinism he rants and rails against. And this is the idea that his big bête noire is the Calvinist idea of original sin. He thinks that schools have bought into this big time, and he's sort of right here. So in previous podcasts, post-Reformation, universal schooling comes in. That was very much part of the Reformation. Certainly in Northern Europe, and the schooling I received was thoroughly Calvinist, believe me. England less so, but Northern Europe certainly. And the idea of, original sin, we're born with this deep imperfection when we have to atone for our sins, as it were. It's very different from the Catholic Church in that sense. But he thinks that that's deeply embedded in the schooling system. Now, how do we translate that? You see the learner as just being full of imperfections. Not being able to read and write is because therefore you can't read scripture, is an imperfect state for a human being to be in. I think this is really interesting also in terms of the general mood even now. This idea that, for learning and development, for example, in organizations, that employees are seen as having all these deficits. In other words, they're sort of racist, sexist, they don't have any leadership qualities, they don't have this, they don't have that, but we'll bash them into shape. We'll cure them of their original sin. I think there's a strong strain of this in the learning world, that we're curing deficits as opposed to being additive and creating rounded people. But to go back to Illich, so 1971, that's right, that was the date that we've established now. At that point, he thinks all of this Calvinist route really in education has caused all sorts of bad things to happen, and all these confusions really. And the confusion is by testing people, In other words, it's almost like the pearly gates. When you die, you will be tested for your sins. So we confuse grades with education, for example. We confuse tests, teaching to the test as a result of this. We also confuse teaching with learning. And this is really interesting in Illich. And I wholly agree with this. Somebody told me once they went to see Illich in England, and he sat down at the front. It was a university, sat in the university lecture theatre, and the guy introduced him, and he just sat there completely silent. And people were slightly puzzled. They wanted a lecture. And he point blank refused to say anything until somebody asked a question. And somebody did. And apparently the session was brilliant. Because he just didn't believe in this notion of, I'm the teacher, you're the learner. It was like a false binary for him in a way. He thought that the whole thing about, bits of paper did not match competence at all. People with bits of paper very rarely had competencies that were effective in the real world. The fact that you can write an essay doesn't actually mean you can write a strategy for a company or, a report or whatever. It's the two things are very, very far apart. And he also thought that simply this sort of rigorous attendance of school, every hour a bell rings, you move on and so on, was a very monastic Calvinist view of education as well. So all these things are confused. And I think he sees it as a very technocratic, bureaucratic world, schools. And I think he's right. When you go into school, well, there's the office with the admin over there, there's a senior leadership team here, there's that department, corridors, it's like a Kafkian sort of world, really. But he thought it was all based on a grand illusion, that illusion. And that I go back to this phrase again, that teaching is not a necessary condition for learning. He really did believe that. And of course, it's true. I haven't been in a classroom for 40 years. I've learned loads. And I can't remember the last time I actually got taught by anybody in any formal sense at all. I'm an adult, I can do it myself. So he attacks schooling on the basis of you can't just throw people together and then separate them out in these level sedimentary layers by age. He says that's totally and utterly unnatural compared to the real world. This teachers and learners distinction, he doesn't like that much. He doesn't like this idea that you have to turn up 9 to 5 like an office every week to learn either. He thinks there's something slightly weird about that. And then also the whole examination accreditation business. So those are the 4 big practical things he doesn't like about the technocratic, bureaucratic idea of schooling.
And they're pretty fundamental to education as we know it, aren't they?
It's a process, and he didn't like the process. And he didn't like the process for human reasons, really, because he thought this killed off. He was a bit like Ken Robinson. I don't wholly agree with this, by the way, but he did get killed off. That sort of the ability of human beings to develop in a more natural and humane way to produce the rounded individual. Shoving them into a Victorian classroom for literally 13 years, then go to university and sit in lecture halls. He just thought there was something slightly ridiculous. He thought we were sort of blind to this. He thought we had been fooled into thinking this is good, and we become addicted to it because if we went through it, it must be good for our kids. And it's a very, the whole bells, corridors, prize giving thing, prefects. He just abhorred it. He thought it was ridiculous. And when you sit back from it and you get a bit older, you look back and you get that feeling. But he called it an addiction and wanted us to break our addiction from it. It's almost like I suppose losing your faith if you're a Calvinist or a Catholic, and suddenly coming out and being secular. That's what he wanted to induce in people here. And he saw, and then so that was the background to his attack. It's called deschooling. He didn't actually choose that title. He didn't like the title, actually, deschooling, because he didn't want to get rid of, suggested you get rid of education and learning. He just had an alternative view of it.
Yeah. Sounds quite modern now, though, doesn't it? It's like one of those terms we'd hear, like, defunding and defund the police and deschool the schools. So maybe it's time for him to have a bit of a renaissance. In the last episode, when we were talking about Steiner, I kind of rather potentiously use that term orthogonal to say that it seemed to me that Steiner wasn't in any of the kind of accepted currents of thought at that time. He just seems to kind of stick out at an odd right angle. Yeah. When I was the little I have read about Illich, when I was looking at it, I found some of it difficult to understand what he was arguing about the church with. And it really reminded me of, again, the little reading I've done in Catholic philosophy. People like Teilhard de Chardin, who is a big Catholic thinker, gets a name check in Cheers, weirdly enough, the TV program. But you read that stuff and it's just so different to anything that I'd read at university. It's not Marxist, not Freudianism. It's not in any of those traditions. You'd have to know a lot about Aquinas really to understand all of it. They have a different kind of terminology and, but how do you feel that Illich, that for you, does he sit within what you understand as being the currents of thought of his time, or is he similarly a bit orthogonal?
Well, it's a good comparison. It was orthogonal in the following sense. So you're rightly saying that Rudolf Steiner was orthogonal, like a perpendicular right angle shoots off to the side of all this weird, like astral belief systems. I think Illich is orthogonal in a different way. It's almost like an acute angle where he's shooting off, but into the future a little bit. And I'll explain why I really do believe that. When I read Illich now, it seems remarkably contemporary. I had a look at the book this morning again. It's like so fresh. And that's because he pointed towards the possible use of technology to create institutions. So he was, he really saw the future here, very definitely. So he thinks that the possible, what he called the possible use of technology, which is now the real use of technology, can really serve autonomous learning in a way it never could. And I think that's come to pass. I think actually much of what we do in universities could be well served by just having autonomous learners encouraged with good technology to get through that process now. I think it's eating and creeping into the whole education system, certainly in the whole learning in the workplace thing, it definitely is. But what did he mean by that? Because he was quite specific about this acute leap into the future. He was quite prescient and prophetic on this. So he thought that technology had all this superb potency or power, which is yet to be realized, because it thought it would democratize learning. There's no doubt about that. He thought we could be creating these educational objects, a sort of familiar term for those in the learning world and so on. He was big on skills exchanges, that notion that there are lots of people in the real world who have skills and they should be teaching others, which is what happens in the workplace. Most learning is through informal learning, not courses. We know this is quantifiable even. And what we do is we pick up skills from other people. So he thought that we could be using technology for a sort of skills exchange idea. It's a sort of YouTube thing. If I want to do something in my car, I go to a YouTube video or a bit of plumbing, and it tells me how to do it on YouTube. In a funny sort of way, I think YouTube is almost a learning platform where it's almost like a skills exchange. He thought there was peer matching was another big thing. That's a Mazur idea that we actually, a really good way to learn is by, sitting or getting to know somebody who really knows their shit, and you learn from them, to keep it simple. And then he thought that there would be a sort of market for it. He's quite sort of curiously right-wing, a very left-wing person with right-wing ideas here. He thought there would be a market for skilled people to be able to do this, sort of freelancers or consultants or whatever. And this, of course, has started to happen. With the internet, we have Wikipedia, for example. Suddenly there was the biggest knowledge base, curiously created in a social fashion, and it was what Illich predicted. He even used the word web, a sort of web of learning. He's predicted the internet, and we're talking about 30 years before it actually happened.
Yeah.
But he was also massively critical, we shouldn't forget this, of the university system as well. He thought it was almost religious, like a religious rite that we've got carried away with. That we put our kids through this sort of rite of passage, sending them off for a few years where they find themselves and so on. He just thought it was ridiculously expensive and almost, counterproductive in a way, So he described it as the most expensive initiation rite the world has ever seen. So I have some sympathy with this view.
Yeah, when you say that, it does make you think of kind of, Oxford colleges and all those cloisters, and
the monastic,
they were essentially built on the top of a monastic tradition, and that was enforced. You had to. A lot of Catholics couldn't go to university before Catholic emancipation because you had to sign up to certain beliefs and so on to actually get in. So yeah, that's interesting.
Well, Peter Thiel is really articulate in this. He thinks there are really direct parallels between the pre-Reformation Catholic Church and higher education. A sort of priesthood has, that we all pay for, is there. You pay for your indulgences, your bits of paper. And, the accusation is if you don't get a bit of paper, you're not going to get to heaven. You're not going to get a good job and earn lots of money. So he thinks the thing has got rotten like the Catholic Church pre-Reformation, and that we're due for a Reformation. And that's a sort of, Illich says the same thing, but he thinks Calvinism is just as bad and replaces Catholicism with something in many ways that's worse, the sort of idea of original sin.
Mm.
But he did think universities had made a big mistake by institutionalizing learning around professions like nursing and teaching. And I've talked about this before. He just doesn't think that's the right place to train those people. I think it's entirely inappropriate because we get addicted to schooling. He thinks we go into these institutions, we think they're necessary and come back and repeat. It's like abuse, if you're abused, you're more likely to be an abuser type thing, It's that idea that's very, very strong in Illich, that we don't realize it, but we get drawn into this model and we can't escape it as adults, so we impose it upon our own children. And he's also really critical of another thing, which I really like in Illich, which is the teacher as therapist or the trainer as therapist. This idea that people who teach your kids actually are also responsible as a sort of pseudo-parent for their emotional and moral development.
And it's called pastoral, isn't it? Is the adjective
it's like they have a religious
especially in university. It's like, that you have a kind of pastoral function as a...
It's a good point, yeah.
It used to be your moral tutor course in Oxford colleges, and when I was at Sussex, I had a personal tutor who had a kind of pastoral function. But you're right, it's religious. Yeah.
It is, that's why it drips off the page, this stuff, Will. Every paragraph, there's an amazing sentence in it, like that little point you just made there, John. And I think he's right on that. I find it absolutely astonishing that academics would think that they're the moral guardians of students. Who do they think? It's a complete conceit. What, just because you know something about chemistry, you're suddenly a moral guardian for my children? I don't think so. And in fact, of course, the last people you'd ever go to really for moral advice or advice on life is probably an academic, who's cloistered themselves away for some time. They're very good at research and admirable intellectually and so on. But let's not stretch the argument into the moral and practical domain as well. Yeah. So, he's pushing out against he doesn't think this classroom is constrictive. He wants to, that's what his deschooling is. It's not, demolish and get rid of schools. He just wants to demolish the physical and metaphorical walls of the classroom, and that they constrict and smother children and students in lecture halls, which is why I told that anecdote about him refusing to lecture. But his legacy for me is this prediction of learning webs, and that I think he's really onto something here, because I think we're now, with this recent AI revolution, finally looking out onto a horizon where this will be realized, where universal teacher, as it were, who knows every subject. There's all this great learning theory built into the pedagogy of the thing, can teach you in any subject, is endlessly patient, 24/7 in every language on the planet. And that sounds quite good to me. I think for the poor in the world, it sounds excellent. And of course, he was big on protecting or nourishing the poor because he thought they got a raw deal. I agree with him. So a very interesting guy. I can't recommend Deschooling Society enough as a book.
John Taylor Gatto, 1935 to 2018. Whenever I hear that name, I think of cake. I'm sorry. John Taylor Gatto was an award-winning American author and school teacher born in a steel town near Pittsburgh in the US. He was educated in the American public school system, which is the opposite to what you'd say in Great Britain. That's kind of state schools, but also at a Catholic boarding school. So two very different types of education. Studied at a number of US universities, a whole list. He said he was a perpetual student, I suppose, including Cornell, Columbia, City University of New York, Berkeley, or however you pronounce it, and several others. Served in the US Medical Corps. Worked as an advertising copywriter, Mad Men era as well. Then in 1960, borrowed his roommate's teaching license and went to work in Harlem as a substitute teacher, very run down there at that point. This started him on a career teaching disadvantaged kids that saw him getting stellar results. He was named New York City Teacher of the Year in 1989, 1990, and 1991, and New York State Teacher of the Year in 1991. But 1991 was the year he quit, very publicly after teaching for nearly 30 years. His resignation letter was in the Wall Street Journal, saying he no longer wished to hurt kids to make a living. It's a bit of the tenor of his kind of rhetorical flourishes. It's quite hyperbolic in a way. He authored several books on modern education, criticizing its ideology, history, and consequences. Best known were Dumbing Us Down, The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Schooling, and The Underground History of American Education, a school teacher's intimate investigation into the problem of modern schooling. Donald, what was the problem of modern schooling in his view?
Yeah, well, I think you summed that up quite nicely in the biographical sketch there. He did, with that phrase, dumbing us down, he really thought that was true. He thought that the system, in a sense, was quite class-based. He taught it's really interesting. Teachers very often come out on, especially on social media, say, well, all these people who don't teach, criticizing us as teachers in schooling, they don't know what it's like. Well, this guy did know what it was like. Taught in Harlem for years, top of his game. A particular focus on the poor, and just walks out one day. What an extraordinary story. Walks out and goes, I'm doing more harm than good here because of the system. And there were several aspects of the system he didn't like. He absolutely, just like Illich, he hated that notion of confinement, that smothering of kids, the testing system, the fixed periods, the standardization, really, that templating the state's view of what education would be through a fixed curriculum. Now, he has some very interesting things to say about that. I'll come to that in a moment. But he also thought that the exclusion of parents and families from schooling was a big mistake socially. He thought that putting that wall between teachers and pupils and their parents and families was a big mistake. In fact, what he really hated when he left, it was really interesting. He ranted and railed against this. Parents and families were treated as the enemy by teachers. He used really bitter language about that, and he thought that led to all sorts of problems. So he did become quite a sort of like a weird sort of right-wing sort of, almost a caricature, to be honest, and as he went on here, like hardcore right-wing libertarian type thing. Nevertheless, the stuff he wrote was really interesting. So if I come back to the curriculum thing, John, because that's the most interesting thing for me. So he wrote this book called An Underground History of American Education, big sort of fattish book. It's actually not well written at all. I think he was a better teacher than a writer, I should say. But he did what we did in our podcast. He went back to the Prussian origins of the US schooling system. And of course, he did what we did. We quoted with Horace Mann, the report. So he comes into Massachusetts, he brings the Prussian system, including the curriculum. And this is what's often, so you get the Prussian idea of templates and order, the school hour, the bells, the 9 to 5 type system we all know. But it's the fixed curriculum he really looked at, because that was two other people. So there's a guy called Conant, another guy called Inglis. They actually fossilized the curriculum. The subject division thing, first of all, so you have maths, English, all those little complete silos. They're all taught separately by separate teachers. That was a Prussian idea. And then you have so that's the vertical silos, and then you have age grading across that, constant testing to see if you've adhered to the curriculum, even punishment to make sure that you adhere to this thing. He thought this was a fossilized view of the curriculum syllabus in education. And then on top of that, a layer of behaviorism that was completely out of order, which he didn't like. Also, a sort of business Taylorist view of the world. And so he really goes into town about the government's role in all this, and thought that all these, when he worked in Harlem, he has this big list of 22 agencies, and he attacks them each one by one. He's saying this is a whole thing that's governed by the state, by faceless bureaucrats, technocrats, and it doesn't do children any good whatsoever, but it does keep them all in a job. So he'd be ranting and railing against Ofsted, just like most teachers. But of course, he didn't much like teaching either, because he thought this was a sort of factory model, really used that word. He thought that actually what most people don't realize because they forget. He says that most people think they have a sort of glowing, rosy red view of school when they leave, only the ones who do well, of course. He thinks actually when people really reflect on their time at school, it's mostly boredom or disinterest. You know, that if you really look at kids in a classroom, it's very hard to maintain their attention for even an hour on any single subject.
Yeah. And
that it's at completely odds with this age mixture outside of schools and relationship kids have with their families or their communities. And he thought that, use the prison analogy really, but he thinks that school knocks the humanity out of people, and that they become these rather odd caricatures of themselves. Funnily enough, he's quite an extrovert. If you've ever seen him speak in videos on, but he also thinks that solitude is very good for children. Periods of solitude where kids learn to sort of control their own emotions and don't get carried away with a peer group who bully other peer groups. This is really at odds with the social view of education, which people love. And I have some sympathy with his view here. I think we just throw that word social in the front of everybody and think it's a cure-all for everything. But actually, for many people at school who perhaps don't fit in, who may be slightly autistic or, have dyslexia or whatever, these peer groups are brutal and horrible, for those kids. So it doesn't surprise me that lots of parents are pulling their kids out of school because their kids don't have a happy time. They're either bored or bullied. So people think school's great, social, but the social thing can be bitter and horrible to learn that you have a problem with kids committing suicide even on the back of this. So education is not the same as schooling for him. Education is something different. He makes that distinction. And he also likes communities and networks. Like send your kids to sports clubs, get them to learn music outside of school. I did that with my kids, certainly. And I think it did them no end of good to have something to balance out the strictures of school.
Absolutely. You've told us a lot about what he was against. What was he in favour of? Apart from the solitude thing, which is an interesting addition, I think. But.
Well, I think this is his big weakness here, because he comes out as a libertarian, voucher-driven type American guy, who thinks, the market will sort it out, as it were.
Yeah.
Which I don't think is true. And that's the danger. But he was very much an American critic of the American schooling system, and didn't really pay any attention, from what I've read of Gatto, to other models here, whether it's Chinese or European models, which are very different in themselves, depending on what country you're in. So I think, to be fair, he does concrete recommendations on what he gets rid of. But that one about giving children periods of silence is really an interesting thing, isn't it? Because it's so at odds with what every teacher thinks. He thought you recommended plenty of solitude for kids so that they can learn to live with themselves. And it's a Vygotskian thing, the internal dialogue, that notion that they should be thinking. It's what you do as a student. You go to the library or you lock yourself in a room. That's where you do a lot of learning, isn't it? You're sitting there with these figures, learning maths, learning philosophy, learning English, but it's an internal dialogue that allows you to mature. This is what Vygotsky thought was terribly important. But we sort of knock that out of people when we make them sit in classrooms with 29 other people or in large lecture halls where they're massively distracted. So he thought it was important not to addict children to peer groups and being in social groups all the time. Because in real life, you aren't necessarily, 24 hours a day with other people and strangers. He didn't like the crowd or peer groups, which schools tend to promote. That's an interesting, positive thing, I think, because I've always been highly suspicious of the whole everything should be social. All knowledge is socially constructed, so I just don't believe that. I've never been a social constructivist.
Yeah.
And so he appealed to me on that front.
Apart from the more extreme dangers of kind of, bullying and suicide and so on, I could pick up on the vocabulary of Molesworth to return to our introduction. There is this word SWAT. One thing I can remember about school is like being at great pains not to distinguish myself academically in, the kind of first 3 or 4 years of my secondary school, because the penalty for doing that was terrible. The bright kids really got kind of really got pilloried, And I think there is a tendency for people to kind of hide the light under a bushel and to actually depress their results, because the people they hang around with, and the peer group, does not like it. The peer group wants to kind of keep that you're going over to the enemy if you're showing any interest in the process, really. And I think that's probably more widespread than people really like to talk about. Interesting.
No, I think that's true, and I experienced that, an extreme form of that, when I was at school, being a sort of one of the sorts that it's a bookish kid, really. Yeah. I was okay though, and because I hardly any people in my school went to university at all, and but the interesting thing there is you become smart enough to know what the problem is, if you're smart enough.
Yeah, is
that actually these people know the game, what the game is here, and that you're going to get the rewards and they're not. And therefore, I think there's a sort of quite early awakening in kids that, the middle class kids in the schools who come with their brand new uniforms and new school bags and so on are on a different game here. Their parents can play a game that they're going to lose at. So I was a bit sympathetic to that. There was an ever-present threat of violence to anybody who was academic in my school. But you learn to befriend a few people who can protect you and all that sort of. You learn a lot in school other than that, being a SWAT and picking up on subjects. Yeah. So
the other thing is silence as well. I think, I've seen again and again on reports that came back from, our eldest daughter is very, very, very bright. The one thing, she's very silent. Class doesn't say much. And if kids don't talk in school, it's seen by the teachers being a kind of sign of non-participation in what's going on in the classroom, and is treated as a problem. In my primary school, I was so silent that I was taken out of class and given batches of hearing tests, intelligence tests, because I think they thought I was a bit, I had learning difficulties. And they discovered what it was, is that I already knew how to read when I went to school. So Janet and John wasn't giving me a lot of stimulation. So I just kind of gazed out the window.
That's a very interesting point, John. It's a Gatto point around this, about not treating people who are quiet. There's a very good book I've got called Quiet that I read a couple of years ago on this very point, that introverts, the kids who go on to just do coding and so on, who are usually super smart and interesting, don't do well in school, because the expectation is hands up anyone, in the school or social environment. Anybody got the answer to this when all the extroverts put their hands up? Well, those kids are sitting there. And then, let's do role play in the workplace. Are you kidding me? All these extrovert trainers want to be slightly theatrical about everything, when in the real world, loads of people just think this is idiocy and childish, infantile. So I think education has a tendency to lean towards extroverts. Would wholly and utterly agree with that. And that's one of the points Gatto makes here. There was a quiet, pregnant pause there, John. I like that.
So John Holt, 1923 to 1985. Our next theorist is John Holt, not the famous Jamaican reggae singer who wrote The Tide is High, as covered by Blondie and Atomic Kitten, but an American author and educator, a proponent of homeschooling, specifically the unschooling approach, and a pioneer in youth rights theory. I have to say, when I was preparing for this, I got very distracted and spent a whole morning listening to John Holt, not this John Holt, but the early work of the Jamaican reggae set. And the early stuff is really brilliant. Just such an amazing voice. But it did start me thinking, how do people like that learn to do what they do? And I was thinking of kind of Muddy Waters. How did he learn the blues? It wasn't at school. It was hanging around in very probably not very child-safe environments, although there are certain educational establishments that don't really offer child-safe environments, like kind of blues clubs and so on, learning from older people. And this is a real thing in music, is that you learn from kind of older people. And that made me think of Illich and what you were saying earlier, that you're denied that. If you only learn from a teacher and from your peer group, you don't get this thing of kind of mentoring, which is, in other circumstances, is an important part of learning, really. Fixing on someone who's older, who you admire, who then agrees to pass their knowledge and skills on to you. It's not catered for that much in the education system. Anyway, back to Holt.
Yeah.
Born in New York City, graduated from Yale University in 1943 with a degree in industrial engineering, interestingly, but signed up to be a submariner in World War II. On his discharge, he joined the United World Federalists, an organization that promoted world peace through the formation of a single world government. Not a completely new one on me, that. I'd never heard of that. He rose up the ranks of this organization and served as the executive director of the group's New York State chapter when he left in 1952 due to frustration with the organization's lack of progress in forming a world government. He then became a school teacher, teaching at elementary and middle schools in Colorado and Massachusetts, but 2 schools in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But he quite quickly became disillusioned with what he saw in the education system, much more quickly than Gatto. I mean, Gatto did 30 years and Holt did far fewer. And believing that the system was unreformable, began to recommend homeschooling. He wrote books, including How Children Fail, followed by How Children Learn, and in 1981, Teach Your Own, which became the Bible of the early homeschooling movement. He also started a newsletter and even set up a bookshop to promote the ideas. Donald, what were his particular dissatisfactions with schools, and how do they compare or contrast with those of Gatto and Illich? Do they all kind of fall in complaining about the same things, or is there a difference here?
Yeah, I think there's a difference. I always learned something from your biography. I had no idea about him being part of the New World Order.
It's a bizarre one, that, isn't it?
I had no idea that was true of Holt. Yeah, I missed that one for some reason. I don't think he put it in his books, in learning. But
probably not.
Yeah, so we tackled Illich, the deschooling, let's call that the title of his book, and then we had Gatto, which is almost like unschooling. But this guy is known as the grandfather or father of homeschooling.
Yeah,
and people like Illich didn't like the term homeschooling because he did, and neither. To be fair to Holt, he didn't like it much either, to be honest, because in fact, if you look at the titles of his book, they don't have homeschooling in the title. How children. So the first one is How Children Fail.
Then How Children Learn.
And then How Children Learn, and then he goes on to do the real teach your own type stuff. And then he had this amazing newsletter that became, and still is, like an amazing thing in the homeschooling movement. But he also didn't like the word home, the suggestion that, we just keep kids in the house and they don't get any social life or whatever. He was very suspicious of the word itself, but he is the homeschooling guy. Anybody who's involved in it knows Holt. But he's also like the other two, hypercritical of, he thought that schools it produced stupidity, funnily enough. He thought the end product was just awful, this conformist, test exam-driven kids who just get far too much knowledge shoved at them. That notion of Freire's banking of knowledge, that's what you're rewarded for. Any other things in life, like being a really good musician, perhaps you get rewarded less, or being good with your hands, or being good with your heart, and an emotional sort of person who might go on and become a nurse. Those things aren't respected. What's respected is the head and cognitive stuff. He thought that was the opposite of what life is and should be. So it was a big moral thing for him that schools promoted head at the expense of hand and heart. So he was friendly with Illich as well. He was a good friend of Ivan Illich. So the two are sort of entwined here. So in his book, Escape from Childhood, he thought what was important here is to recognize the rights of children. These are real human beings that are going to evolve, adapt, and grow up into the real world, and that we're doing them real harm. He was really big on this notion of the children not having a say, like a vote at age 11 or whatever, but listening to their needs, So his practical stuff on homeschooling was full of being careful with the emotional needs of a child, as well as, of course, their very clearly their educational needs. And so he produces all these manuals. And today, in Brighton, I know somebody around the corner who they have 3 kids, one very young, the other 2, I think about 11 and 13, who don't go to local secondary schools. And they're really interesting kids, and they're the very opposite of what you expect. They're massively social and very comfortable at speaking to adults.
Yeah.
Whereas most kids are a bit mopey and a bit teenagey. These kids are there, and they go down to the skate park. They're good at skating. They're academically quite good. So I think there's this myth that homeschooling is a complete and utter disaster and it all takes place in the home. And of course, people who do it seriously do the very opposite. They don't lock their kids up at home. They make sure they get a more experiential and sophisticated view of the world outside of the home. Very often, you rightly said there, John, I remember at school, this is what music, I was reflecting on this when you talked about music. I'll tell you what I got at both primary and secondary school and Scottish schooling system. We sat in a class while some old codger plonked out green sleeves and hymns on a piano and we sang them. I did that for years. I have no idea why we did it, what relation it had to education. I never went near a musical instrument. Absolute, in the inanity of it. That's all I got, even in secondary school. Now, I was lucky enough, because a friend of mine, his father played the bagpipes, and my introduction to music was, he gave me a chanter, which is the bottom little thing. It's like a flute with a reed on the top. It's quite a difficult instrument to play, because you play straight to the reed. I absolutely loved this thing and became quite competent until we left. And that was me. But I could hammer out a little way, Scotland the Brave on the chanter and the bagpipes.
Wow.
But isn't that bizarre that compare and contrast, I really would have liked to have gone on and, done something in that area, but it was thwarted because I got absolutely nothing at school. And to be fair, with my kids, it was a bit better because I have two boys, one of them very interestingly got introduced. To be fair, the school was quite good in this local school because they brought in external guitar and drum teachers and so on. And then if you were interested in an instrument, they put you in touch with a guy and the parents would pay a wee bit, but it was subsidized. And that worked wonders for my kid who became very good at drums. We played long after they left school for years and years, all sorts of things from jazz to you play anything really, and read music. And now that was completely really, to be fair, the catalyst was the school, but it happened outside of the school because
there's a thing called Rock School, isn't there, in Brighton?
That's right.
Yeah, they do kind of these regular events in Blakers Park in 5 Ways, in a part of Brighton, folks. It's getting very parochial here, I'm afraid. And they would put on these concerts, and all the kids would come up and play all this stuff, varying age groups, and I have this abiding memory of these kids running through, I think, a Rage Against the Machine number, and this little kid, probably, I don't know, 10 or 11, going, "Fuck you, won't do what I say, you tell me. Fuck you, won't do what I tell you." And the parents, just in front of us saying, "Jimmy's coming on very well with his singing now, isn't he?" It's the most middle class thing you can imagine. But,
well, one of my boys, he actually did it in the Dome because I was, as you involved, I was deputy chair of that organisation, and it was absolutely fantastic every year because Brighton's full of retired rock musicians or punk musicians like yourself, John. And so there was no end of willingness of people to teach these kids, and they would get them together at the beginning of the week on the Monday or Saturday, I can't remember, and then they would get them to join bands. They'd never met each other, so they would learn how to get on with each other. And by the end of the week, on the Friday night, they would perform in front of a big audience. And I was always astonished at how good this was. There would be kids who would do reggae or rock or whatever, some classical, And they had written this. The rule was they had to write fresh material. I was surprised that you had heard Rock Against the Machine, Rage Against the Machine, because the kids I saw had written original compositions and lyrics and stuff. And it was really good,
Yeah.
So I suppose it backs up what I'm saying. We both had that experience with our children where clearly, I think a lot of parents have this, looking back, you go, actually, their main and most fruitful influences were sometimes at school. Boys, the shaping educational experience in his life really was a sport, Taekwondo. He got into the England team and he fights now all over the world and has for many years. It's shaped his life morally as a person. He absolutely loves and adores it. But he also did the degree. He's got a degree in the artificial intelligence and all that sort of thing. It was separate from it. And then his twin brother, this was it's like living with a psychological experiment. I brought them up the same way. Didn't go to university at all. Couldn't wait to leave school. Very sociable kid. And he became the drummer and went into marketing, runs his own company, and now hires graduates. So, your kids, school's a funny thing, isn't it? It's almost as if it tries to thwart what they really want to do, but they eventually find themselves and do what they want to do.
It's interesting though what you're saying that in both music and sport there is a kind of mentoring thing that happens outside school there.
Exactly.
That happens there's and in rock music now there's a kind of tradition that bands of old gits of my generation will get back together, but the drummers died through substance abuse, so their son sits in or daughter, whatever. So you do see much more multi-generational bands nowadays, and and there is a lot of that, but in music and in sport you don't get that so much in more academic subjects.
No. Well, I suppose with music, you can carry on a la Mick Jagger till you're in your 80s, whereas in sport, your sort of career comes to an end in your 30s if it's a hardcore physical sport. But
you become a coach.
You become a coach, yeah. In fact,
my point, really. Yeah.
That's right. And that Callum does a lot of coaching now, and he can grade people, and he's got high level international coaching qualifications. So there's a way forward in that. I think that's right, but I think a lot of parents have this experience where, and perhaps these three people we've discussed have this theme in common, which is that school isn't the be all and end all in terms of education of young people. And we should loosen up on this a little bit and perhaps allow a sort of form of growth out with the school, whether it's in music and sport and all sorts of other things, because they do it better. Because it's a very curriculum structured, templated, one size fits all world, whereas sport and music isn't like that at all.
Yeah.
But what these three critics of education have been telling us in their own different ways is that also applies to actually some of the school subjects as well, like maths, science, whatever, English literature. And I think there's an interesting, I think there are interesting things happening now on that front, isn't there? Because post-COVID, we've had this massive, in a sense, these people were predicted this. You've had a massive rise in homeschooling and absence. Those are two separate things, but they overlap. So there's some of the surveys and stats are astonishing. The number of homeschool students has risen dramatically post-COVID by about 50%, especially in the US. So that you've got, roughly about 2.5, some people think 2.7 million homeschooled people in the US. That's more than the number of people at Catholic schools now. It's become a really significant player, homeschooling. And of course, there was a surge because of COVID, and it may be the lasting effects of COVID, but it's multivariant. There are all sorts of causes behind this. I think homeschooling is no longer seen as a sort of fringe activity for the religious people or, just very progressive people. I think it's sort of drifting towards the mainstream now and seen as an option, because the technologies that allows you and the networks and communities of homeschooling people are big enough now for you to do it and think it's possible. So,
to your point, actually, if I could be allowed one more Brighton-based anecdote, we have this glorious institution in Brighton, which kicks off the Brighton Festival every year, which is a fairly sizable festival for those in other countries. Sizable arts festival, probably the biggest after Edinburgh, and it's kicked off by the Children's Parade, where all the local schools through the whole area kind of put on the bits of this parade, and you have samba bands and everybody dresses up and they have themes and massive papier-mâché floats that the kids work on all year round. But it's really interesting to, as parents, stand beside that that procession and see the different styles of all the local schools as they come through. So the private schools go in for it, the faith schools, who quite regimented in particular uniforms and all the rest of it. And then you have the kind of samba bands ones. My daughter played in a samba band for years, and we used to have to go to this event, which is always held on a Saturday morning. All the parents had grisly hangovers and cups of coffee and everything. And then finally one year, they admitted the homeschool people into it. There'd been all these schools, and then you got the homeschool people, and everybody else had these incredible floats. Some of them were really sort of like light up, mechanized, very, very organized. And the homeschool people came past, and it was kind of delightfully sort of anarchic, shambolic, and but joyful in a way. And it just made me think that my kids would make jokes about homeschool people. Homeschooling as an option is socially ostracized because it's completely outside the peer group forces. And even now, I feel like that description, I'm kind of making jokes at it, and as they we were all laughing as they went past. Oh God, there's the homeschool people. And that's weird. But their inclusion in the procession, I felt, was some kind of acknowledgement of what you're saying there, that it's much more a thing. And the pandemic, of course, has given it an extra boost. So summing up, Donald, were these three voices crying in the wilderness, so to speak, or do they represent wider currents of dissatisfaction with the Prussian system, as we kind of, just to give it that name, to be able to kind of talk about it as a thing? And did they have any effect on mainstream opinion and practice?
Well, I think their practical effects at the time were minimal, as we've discussed, because state schooling or private schooling is still the dominant paradigm. But we started to drift into an interesting phenomenon just a few moments ago there, because actually John Gatto said something interesting, which I agree with him on, which is that schooling is unreformable, which is why he left. He thought, it's a waste of time staying here. There's nothing I can do to change it because it's so fossilized, so structured, so solid politically, institutionally. It's just sort of, an immovable object, unreformable. But unreformable things are never wholly unreformable, because shit happens and something like COVID comes along. And so an external force can be very, very powerful here. And what's interesting about their prescience here was that actually what they said is likely to happen at some point is starting to happen. So if we take Illich, he thought that technology would have a massive impact on schooling once it matured, and that these webs of knowledge and the ability of learners, not teachers, to educate themselves with their parents, whatever, would happen quite readily. We're sort of on the verge of that now. We have the AI thing, Can Mingo, $9.99. You can teach any subject in this thing. It's absolutely amazing in terms of the personalized feedback. Being trialed massively in America at the moment with things like Duolingo, Wikipedia. We've had this big rush of things now on the back of AI, and it will grow rapidly. Duolingo, for example, is folded in ChatGPT. ChatGPT seems to know everything and almost everything. Suddenly, it's a real practical option in the way Illich envisaged here, that technology would allow learners to be autonomous learners, because teachers would be replaced by really smart teachers, but through technology. So I think his dream is sort of starting to come true now because of the AI revolution, nothing to do with COVID. I think in terms of Gatto, I think his vision was more of a critique of schools, but nevertheless, I think his attack on that bit of a myth that schools are where you socialize children, well, maybe not. Maybe it's a bad form of socialization, the reinforcement of really horrible peer groups who bully other people, for example, or where quiet autistic or neurodiverse people have no role, find themselves absolutely abandoned, and often suffer really badly. I think don't underestimate the amount of suffering that kids have through school, who think it's a very jolly hockey stick sort of place, but not for a lot of people. I think Gatto is right there. And then the big one for me is John Holt and homeschooling, because that's alive and kicking. And as we just said, is becoming very big indeed. Substantial portions of populations are now homeschooling because of the technology, a la Illich, the unreformable nature of schooling. So it's not coping well with all these problems. Mm. And when you look at the way in which this sudden, let's call it a little revolution in schooling through homeschooling or autonomous schooling has gone, even in higher education, do you really need the degree? Enrollments in American universities have been going down for 13 consecutive years. 13 years in a row they've been going down. Attitudes towards getting a degree or higher education in the US have plummeted across all demographics. So there's a crisis in relevance, I think, in higher education, which some of these critics thought is warranted. We've gone through that in detail. But the reasons for this are bubbling to the surface here, John. I feel, that there's real concerns by parents about schools and paying for university. Is it worth it? But real concerns about bullying and all sorts of things. And that. I think there's a second thing. Some people just don't like the moral view of school. Some people don't like it because it's too right wing. Other people think a lot of the sort of culture war stuff is ridiculous in schools, and how dare you teach children things that I disagree with. They have a point as well. I think there's a lot of politicization of schools that
huge amount. It's some parents are getting scared that their kids are being forced to transition to another gender, and they're getting worried about what's in the books they're reading. Kids in school have been reading things like Lord of the Flies and so on for ages, but now there's a tremendous focus on this. And I'm not just talking about. I saw this in my local magazine. These magazines they send around to, completely local advertising full of ads for plumbers. Have little articles in there. There's a big thing in there about kind of critical race theory and how we have to find out what our lefty teachers are actually teaching. This is in Brighton. Well, given it, North Brighton, Patcham, which is a bit more conservative than the rest of the town. This is not just happening in Florida. It's happening all over the place. It's incredibly politicized on both sides of the.
I think that's right. There are different angles, of course, because the Americans, there is a really big thing in homeschooling is the fear around school shootings. So that doesn't exist at all here and anywhere else in the world. I don't think it's a big American thing. But there's some of the commonalities are bullying the over liberal or over right wing viewpoints. People don't like that, some religious stuff thrown in there as well. But I think there are real concerns against neurodiversity as well. Parents whose kids they feel don't fit in or badly bullied, taking their kids out of school. I think that's become a big thing as well. Behavioural problems at schools. They see schools as rough and ready sort of places where it's difficult for some kids to survive, even never mind thrive. All of these multivariant things are coming together. And if you have an alternative to state or formal schooling, it's become possible. And that's what I'm hearing now. And I know some of those people. We do live in Brighton, which is a bit of an exception. And I was the deputy chair of that very festival for 10 years. And we love the Children's Parade because it's probably the best bit of it for me, because actually the Arts Festival was very much targeted at upper middle class people, if the truth be told, with classical concerts. But we tried to make it as democratic as possible. But the Children's Parade was a star of the show because everybody was there. The whole town came out, which was absolutely heartening and brilliant, as you nicely described, very vividly described, John. But I think the inappropriateness of the schooling model is stronger now than it's ever been in my lifetime because the alternatives are there.
Yeah. Isn't it difficult, though, to make the difficult here, we're talking particularly about criticisms of schools, and you can criticize schools and for all these reasons, and you can say they're unreformable. But then doesn't that then mean, kids have got to learn? How are you going to do that? Do you build a new system from the ground up? Do you burn everything down and build a new system completely up? That just doesn't seem to be practical. On the other hand, it seems like, as we both know, education is incredibly conservative as a business sector compared to, say, training. I've never understood why education is always competitive. Training isn't competitive. You just want everyone to kind of hit a certain mark to be able to do their jobs, and maybe the better ones will get creamed on the basis of performance, not credentialization. But schools are always competitive. It's always kind of who came top of the class, let's stream you to make sure that the slow ones don't hold back the fast ones. And we'll give you your ranking all the time of where you are in the system. It's completely different. So to replace that, can you evolve out of that? Is it too rigid to evolve out of? Or, how do you go forward with that change?
Well, I think you can go forward by looking at other systems. It's particularly bad in the UK because you have this incredibly powerful private school system that seems to just grab institutional jobs and politics. That's worse than it's ever been. You don't really get many people who didn't go to uni in the House of Commons or House of Lords these days. So that's been a bad thing. I think in general, if you go, I spend a lot of time in Europe and places like Holland and that, where there's less pressure. It just seems like teachers are parents and so on are less. It's less of that. top of the class really matters, less funneling towards universities. Universities in the Netherlands don't have this big status thing, and obsessed by ranking like the British universities and the US universities. Isn't it odd that universities are obsessed by ranking? Even businesses don't rank themselves. They're the most competitive capitalist places now.
Well, you've got the FTSE 500
them.
and the Fortune 500 and...
Yeah, but that's mostly to do with share price, to be honest, rather than, a quantifiable thing or output.
Yeah.
There's so many of these ranking systems, and you hear every university find, oh yeah, we're number 3 on how green our sports fields are or whatever. So everyone shall have prizes in the ranking system. But no, let's go back to that point. So there is a really serious point here about core education, though, I think some other countries do it better. They don't start until people are much older, getting towards age 7 and so on. Some countries, I think that's sensible. We are obsessed.
Yeah, Finland's always brought up.
Yeah, I think that's right. We're obsessed in this country by that. But there is a serious point here as well, which people sometimes forget. So we have all these movements like reimagining education, reinventing education, there are whole conferences around this. Good people, but they're deluded, I fear, because actually the educational system as funded by the state is the result of a democratic system and the wishes of the parents. And we could, next year, I hope, vote out the current government. And we will have not much change in education. That's the truth. Actually, it seems to be rock solid, no matter Labour or Conservative. And that's what I think Gatto was pointing towards, the unreformable nature of education. Because parents are actually quite conservative, and then Illich and others thought this is because we become addicted to what we experienced, and we just carry on by generation after generation, like religion. If you're born into a Jewish family, you're going to be Jewish. If you're born into a Catholic family, you're Catholic. You think schooling, we're born into schools, we become schoolers. And the answer to bad schooling is always more schooling. Let's make them turn up at 7 o'clock in the morning and release them at 6 at night or something ridiculous. But the truth is also, I think it's right that it should be a democratic thing. Unfortunately, the democratic process produces a graduate class that grab the political capital and then impose that upon everyone else. And the majority of people who do not go to university, of course, get squeezed out year after year after year, and that's what's happened over the last few decades, the elastic stretching of inequalities towards a graduate class that now controls politics and therefore controls the budgets and decision-making around education and has fossilized it even more. And that's why I'm quite in favor of homeschooling. I'm, more power at your elbow. If you want to do it, I'm all for it. I'm all for a bit of a more heterogeneity into what is a very homogeneous system. But still, there are lots of people who don't want to do that because they work hard. It would be unimaginable for my parents to homeschool me because both worked shifts. So it would be like completely and utterly impractical. We don't all have jobs where it's convenient. You hang around all day with your kids. Many families have hardcore jobs where they're exhausted at the end of the day, and the last thing they want to be doing is nurturing their kids through homeschooling or homework. So there are a number of big, heavyweight political issues around this, and it's too easy to jump onto the progressive bandwagon and imagine that all schools are bad, they're like prisons. But you asked a very interesting question halfway through the podcast, John. What's the alternative? Then things become tricky, because homeschooling is not the alternative we may think it is.
I think it'd be interesting if we were to look back in 5 years on this conversation. I mean, very often change seems impossible to people, and actually it's just around the corner and you just don't know it. Like it must have seemed to kind of people just for the French Revolution, things will just go on as they are. But who knows? This is my way of kind of glossing the fact that I've raised the question that we can't possibly answer in the last dying moments of this podcast. But it's been an absolutely fascinating scamper through the case for the prosecution.
Yes, sure.
I think we've done that pretty thoroughly. And it'd be interesting to move on to coming up in Berlin what I think is probably what a lot of people in education feel is what is coming for them, which is generative AI and the learning implications of that, and the history of how that came to be with learning theory and so on. So thank you very much for this one, Dom.
Thank you, John.
Great Minds on Learning comes from the Learning Hack team and is produced by John Helmer. The podcast is based on a series of blog posts written by Donald Clark, and we thank Donald for his kind collaboration in this project. If you'd like text summaries and transcripts for these podcasts, as well as ads-free listening, early access to episodes and more, why not join the Learning Hack Pack? For less than the price of a coffee, you can get all these benefits and help to sustain us into the future. Go to patreon.com/learninghack for a 7-day free trial. That's patreon.com/learninghack.